There's actually a large number of these kinds of grassroots language revitalization efforts. Oftentimes they take place in the basements of churches or synagogues or community centers, and it's always a language champion that's running this, but oftentimes without any background in language teaching and without having had the benefit of looking at their language so that they can teach it to total novices.
You're listening to Speaking of Language, a podcast recorded at the Language Resource Center at Cornell University. Each week, we explore a topic related to language pedagogy and language acquisition. This week on Speaking of Language,
Dr. Daniel Kaufman returns to Speaking of Language to discuss language revitalization, language ideology, the deceptiveness of AI, and more.
Welcome to a new episode of Speaking of Language.
And welcome to International Education Week.
I'm Angelica Kramer, the director of the Language Resource Center at Cornell University.
And I'm Sam Lupowitz, the LRC's media manager.
Dr. Daniel Kaufman is in the studio with us today.
He recently gave a talk as part of our monthly LRC speaker series on current challenges in urban language revitalization, which you can watch on our website.
We will extend our conversation about these challenges on today's episode.
Welcome back to Speaking of Language, Dan.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here. Thanks.
So we already asked you this last time, but can you give our listeners a very brief snippet of your background and your path with languages to start out?
Sure, my pleasure. My background with languages, I'm from New York City, and so that informs a big part of it. But I became interested in my heritage languages, which were kind of Semitic languages. I developed a brief obsession with the Semitic family, linguistic family, that is. And then I would go to the library. I could already tell it's not going to be brief, right? And then it was a Thursday. I used to go off into the Mid-Manhattan Library, which had a wonderful collection of reference grammars, and I kind of became obsessed with reading through reference grammars. And not like I was such a genius that I could absorb them, but I just like to flip through them. And then Tagalog stuck, and then I became interested in Philippine languages. I ended up doing my undergrad study in the Philippines, came back to Cornell to do my PhD, focusing on that family of languages called Austronesian, which Cornell is famous for as well. And then I, after graduating, realizing all of the linguistic diversity and danger that was right there in my hometown, founded this organization to try and protect that.
Sweet. Love it. That was brief.
Yeah.
Could have gone on and on, as you know.
Well, in your talk, you discussed the importance of cities, especially for indigenous communities. What do cities represent for these communities, and are there differences between countries when it comes to cities?
Yeah, so traditionally we think of, these, linguistic diversity being a feature of places with very intense biodiversity, for instance. And we know that there's truth to that. There's a whole organization actually devoted to that link. But places like Vanuatu and Papua New Guinea, these are the places that have both incredibly rich biodiversity and incredibly rich linguistic diversity. Cities are, you think migrants, and traditionally you think of European languages and maybe Chinese languages. But over the last 40, 50 years, there's been just a massive outpouring of people from precisely these areas that are the most linguistically rich in the world into cities, because kind of it's... this is the final stages of industrialization and globalization have finally reached these areas and made it so, it's not a happy movement, as I talked about in the talk. Of course, there are those people who just love the idea of living in a city, but for the most part, people feel forced. And this is due to the collapse of traditional economies. So cities have taken on a really big importance, much bigger even than before, for the futures of indigenous languages. And it's not, nobody's quite clear on what to do about that, because The tradition, of course, has always been to, if anybody is working to stem the tide of language endangerment, it's always in the homeland. And
Yeah. You shared a map of indigenous languages of Mexico and also the Human Development Index. How do these maps relate to one another, and what does this tell us about migration and language or dialect preservation?
Right. So those two maps showed a really strong correlation between the areas of the highest linguistic diversity and the areas that are lowest on the so-called Human Development Index, which is a formula that mixes average lifespan and educational attainment and economic factors as well. So why should that? It's not, we wouldn't guess that there would be such a link necessarily, but the fact is that the areas that are most multilingual are really those areas that you could say held out the best against the encroaching colonial forces, right? And as a result ended up becoming the most marginalized later on, right? So on one hand, these are these amazing areas throughout the world that managed to kind of keep colonialism at bay to some extent, but they also paid an economic price by refusing, by holding on to their languages and refusing to become part of the mainstream kind of colonial mestizo elite.
Right.
So, and not that it was always a choice. I mean,
sure.
Obviously it wasn't really an individual choice, but at the present moment, and what we have, and it's very, comes out in really stark terms in those maps, I think, of Mexico, is that you have these really impoverished regions that are home to such an incredible wealth of language diversity and indigenous knowledge and lifeways and so much more. And these are the places that are suffering the most. And as a result, these are the places that have the most outmigration to the point where many towns are completely bereft of an adult male population.
Wow.
The only people that are left are children and elders who are too old to migrate. So that's the cause of it, I would say. And it's unfortunate. I mean, on one hand, there is this rich tradition of resistance, and on the other hand, there's the sad realities of today. I mean, if things, over the last several years in Mexico, I think there's certainly been a positive change in much more enlightened policies. The current president, Claudia Sheinbaum, has, taken steps that no previous president
Right.
has.
Yeah. Well, I was really struck by the example of indigenous Mexican languages in New York City and the vast number that are present. We already had you talk about the work of the Endangered Language Alliance in New York in a previous episode. For our listeners, you can scroll back to season 15, episode 10 for that. But would you please share with us an example or two about some of the language revitalization work that Ella is doing?
Yeah, so in a way, it's really kind of scrambling and working with the few resources we have in a community that's also very atomized, as I mentioned, and that especially with certain areas, Guatemalan and especially Mexican more than Guatemalan migrants, really. They're really families. They're not, they're not language communities in New York City in the sense that they're organized and they know each other. So anyway, I mean, with the few resources we have, we've tried to do something that had not yet been done in New York, which is to gather families and create a space where mothers can teach their children their language, which is something they wanted to do, but really couldn't figure out the time to do it and how to do it. And, one of us would act as a kind of intermediary to help create materials. But the whole purpose of it and the initiative was really led by, in this case, the mothers. And yes, we've tried to help here and there. There's actually a large number of these kinds of grassroots language revitalization efforts. Oftentimes they take place in the basements of churches or synagogues or community centers, And it's always, a real kind of champion, a language champion that's running this, but oftentimes without any background in language teaching and without having had the benefit of looking at their language, in a more objective way so that they can teach it to total
Right.
novices. So, yeah, big differences in communities, but we see this again and again. So those are exactly the kinds of people we try to work with and try to support in some way, although much, much more can still be done.
Yeah. You also gave us a quote from a Lenape teacher that was, quote, "We are not revitalizing the language is revitalizing us." Can you expand a little bit more on that? You also mentioned that there were certain suggestions from teachers and students in this space about what this all means to them.
Yeah, so that was actually a student of the teachers. Somebody was in the class. The teacher, Karen Moscow Hunter, unfortunately, tragically passed away at quite a young age, I believe 2 years ago. And this was, she would come on a bus. She would drive in a van from Ontario for 5 hours, however long it takes, and bring her whole family. And we would have these wonderful classes once a month with her. But this was a case where, you look at all of the massive ethnic, national, linguistic, cultural diversity in New York City, and what's the one group that's missing? Of course, it's the Lenape. Not because they don't exist anymore, but because they were expelled and they never really were able to make their way back to form a physical community. Of course, there are individuals, there are representatives in the city, but nothing like many of the migrant communities I was talking about. So what does it mean that the language is revitalizing the people? Is that this was a link between a whole kind of very diverse group of people that somehow identified either through a relative or a grandparent with the community. And this was the thing that was bringing them together, because in the city there was no opportunity for them.
Right.
There was no other reason for them to get together, and they didn't necessarily even they didn't know each other. So here the language was creating a community as opposed to what you might think is the more common case where the community is really bringing back, trying to breathe life back into a language.
Right. Interesting.
You just mentioned that people think of New York City as diverse, sort of broadly, and Ella focuses on documenting indigenous, minority, and endangered languages in the city. Can you give us a snapshot of what that linguistic landscape, what that linguistic diversity looks like in New York City?
Yeah, the snapshot is best seen in the digital map, which I can give the URL. It's languagemap.nyc. And there you can see like the best possible snapshot because it has everything we know basically about the linguistic diversity of New York. And this was the work largely of my co-director, Ross Perlin, together with the group and all of these community leaders as well. Ross Perlin, who actually also wrote a book about our experiences in the Endangered Language Alliance called Language City, highly recommended, because it really gives an excellent in-depth look in a number of communities, but really through the eyes of individuals. So it's really an amazing kind of eyewitness view of things. But the diversity, it's very as really jumps out in the map. It's kind of a segregated city, maybe like all cities are, but you find, languages, indigenous languages of South America and Central America, all in in one place, and then in terms of the bigger picture, right? The languages of Africa in another place, and the interesting thing is that there's this succession pattern, which I mentioned briefly earlier, where it seems like people are following other communities that are either neighboring to them in the hometown, and so you had originally a community, say, of Ashkenazi Jews from Eastern Europe, then gives rise to a larger Russian-speaking community, which then attracts newer migrants from places like Tajikistan and Uzbekistan. And so you have these really big kind of global patterns overlaid on the city's geography.
Yeah.
So that's been, an interesting thing. And the neighborhood I mention all the time, of course, is Jackson Heights, where kind of by coincidence, but also due to these succession patterns, you have like all the the countries with the most languages kind of gang up on this neighborhood. And as a result, there's more languages per foot there than any place
That's
on
crazy.
Earth, probably.
Yeah, that's so cool. You also mentioned that New York City has 10 so-called designated citywide languages, but that there are also many more invisible languages. Who designates citywide languages? Like, who comes up with that, and why are certain languages in that group and others remain invisible?
That's a good question. So all of the city agencies, we had to discover this on our own, as we were starting to work more with city agencies. But apparently, the kind of arm of the city government that dictates the language law or implements the city law is called the Mayor's Office of Immigrant Affairs. And they are the ones that kind of ensure that every agency is meeting its goals for language access.
Interesting.
And the laws for language access are actually quite progressive. They state that everybody should be able to get a meaningful access in their own language to all of the city services. The question is, what does it mean to have meaningful access? And, how do you define language? And, of course, there's always little or major issues like that. But even in its weaker implementation, it's still a big challenge that the city has never fully met.
Right.
What often happens is, in terms of medical, hospitals and doctors and even the legal system, they've often had to kind of outsource their translate their interpretations to third-party companies, which sometimes have been okay, other times have not been okay. And so, anyway, the city is the one. The MOIA, Mayor's Office of Immigrant Affairs, is largely in charge of designating which languages are going to be kind of have what kind of priority, and then checking up on all of the agencies, even doing like secret shopper kind of things with the different agencies to make sure that they're doing their job.
Interesting.
Well, so let's talk about language ideology. You conducted a study on this with indigenous groups. What were your findings?
Yeah, so we were really interested in, because this was even more of an issue, thinking about language diversity in a city, and especially thinking about revitalization in a city. One of the big obstacles was, are the communities really, we work with a self-selected group of people who are like, language maniacs, right, like us. And so, of course, we could just always work with that group. But if we're talking about something bigger, then what are the attitudes that people had towards their own language? Did people even see it fit as, do they see their languages as something that should be passed on to their kids in a place like New York? Do they feel comfortable even speaking their language in the street? Things that are taken totally for granted by, speakers of national languages.
Right.
Are, cannot be taken for granted for everybody. And, you would think, how could in this day and age somebody be like ashamed to speak a language in public? That's extremely normal. I mean, unfortunately, extremely normal. So we were interested in those kinds of issues, like, are people ashamed? What kind of experiences of discrimination do they have? Do they think their kids should learn the language in New York? And if so, what's their motivation? So what came out of it was, it wasn't a gigantic study, so I don't know how statistically significant our findings were, but what came out of it was, from some areas, specifically the area Mexico I mentioned, Guerrero, which is where most of the indigenous migrants come from, it was a very kind of pragmatic, practical ideology, you could say. So most parents thought that their children should speak their language. And mostly these were speakers of Tu'unsavi, also known as Mixteco. But it was always like, in order so that they could communicate with my parents, because my parents don't
right.
speak Spanish, right? And once in a while, we found these people who had kind of these other supernatural, spiritual, religious goals for passing on their language. And what surprised me the most was that those actually turned out to be the most effective. And somehow that those families that drew on something spiritual actually, it was a small sample size again,
Sure.
but they seemed to have unusual luck in actually passing their language down. And the families that said, it's just to talk to my parents, it's purely practical, it seems to maybe not have been enough, either maybe for the parents or the children to really push them to fluency. So that was an interesting thing. But also what came out of it was many, many sad stories of discrimination, both from back home and from the city, where, in the workplace, and not only from, mostly from people within the community or within the national community. So it's kind of like internalized discrimination,
Right.
internalized kind of racism, where people feel they have to, hide their identity. And, in these cases especially, it's like a total outsider. Like, what do they know? They have no preconceived notions about Mixteco people.
Right.
But then, for a Guatemalan or a Mexican, they have a mestizo Guatemalan or a Mexican, they have a whole, set of, there's stereotypes.
Sure.
There's, in television and in popular culture, you see indigenous people being mocked as ignorant and things that, as people outside that culture in America wouldn't imagine, or we wouldn't have contact with that. But so a lot of that was much more fierce, like within the national community than
crazy.
outside.
Yeah. Interesting.
But now there's a whole other layer, which is that looking a certain way, basically looking indigenous, is a whole nother danger now for people.
Sure.
In that they can be targeted, even legally it seems, can be targeted
Yeah.
solely on their appearance.
Ugh.
Yuck. How do you say yuck in
Yeah. I feel like that's one that's almost a universal.
universal?
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, my. Dan, you also talked about some of the technical challenges of documenting these languages. Can you expand a little bit on that?
Sure. So yeah, there's technical challenges in documenting, and then there's technical challenges in describing and in teaching. In documenting, I'd say it's less severe. We have a cadre of people who are always ready to record stories, to record interviews, and we've slowly but surely been putting things out for the community, across all genres. What's much trickier is technical or kind of grammar issues, teaching issues, pedagogical issues. How do you teach these languages with, say, massively complex morphologies to speakers of languages like English or Spanish, which are by no means simple languages either, but nothing on the scale or type of many of the languages we work with. So that's, I think, a challenge that every language revitalization program, maybe in the world, but certainly in the Americas, grapples with, because it just so happens that most of the languages of the Americas have complex morphologies and categories that have nothing to do with Spanish or English categories.
Right.
So, so that's something that we're just now starting to explore. I showed a bit of this tool that I originally made with a collaborator, Raphael Finkel, to kind of implement linguistic theory, because I studied here for God knows how many years, and a lot of that was studying abstract theories that were of great interest to
Right.
theoretical morphologists and syntacticians, but quite removed from practical applications and not even implementable necessarily. So originally, I just wanted to implement these theories as something that can take an input and give you back an output. But then naturally, an extension of that is how can you then take this theory implementing machine that produces a word, you give it meaning and it produces a word. How can you make that useful for a language learner?
Right.
And that's where we are now. And what I would like to do is kind of, and all learners are different. I don't think all learners necessarily benefit from this
Sure.
type of kind of, word breakdown. But in a language where the words are equivalent to a whole English sentence or Spanish sentence, people need a leg up somehow. It's just nobody can memorize pages upon pages of paradigms. So we have to make it interactive somehow. And so this is what we're trying to do now, so that you're almost, still a dialogue with a computer, but not in the AI sense as a conversation partner, but rather, you're giving it meaning and it's showing you how to turn that meaning into a word step by step, to conquer this kind of Mount Everest of affixes
Yeah.
in many
Oh,
languages.
no, that's cool.
Dan, you mentioned earlier how, not quite anecdotally, but maybe not quite with a large enough sample size to make a definitive statement, but how these practical, quote unquote, applications of passing on a language seem to be less successful than a more spiritual or otherwise heightened aspirational approach to passing that language on. And I was thinking of that sort of in the context of maybe some things we're seeing on a larger scale in society. How there are a lot of people who say they want, practical, straightforward, efficient solutions, but that's not actually what a lot of people want. That they want something to aspire to, something bigger than that to look towards. So I'm thinking about that in the context of what you're saying, and also in the context of a question you got following your talk about maintaining and learning these languages, and wouldn't AI be a helpful way to do that? And you had some thoughts and feelings on that I thought it would be worth getting you to share with our listeners as well. So
Sure.
why isn't that the route that you're taking, or how do you feel about that?
Yeah, those are good questions, both of them. Let me start with the first one, which is that this is something I really need to devote more thought to because it's important, but I've never really written about it, I don't think, or really thought enough about this distinction I mentioned. Why do the more practically oriented efforts on the part of families seem to fare worse than these kinds of spiritually oriented efforts? And now that I think about it, really, I mean, if you're just learning a language for a very concrete purpose of communicating with, say, a grandparent or grandparents, then everything depends on that communication actually happening. And when it doesn't happen, well, you don't need the language, right?
Right. Huh.
And I mean, in the case I'm talking about, how often does it really happen? I mean, people will talk to their grandparents maybe once a week maximum in these cases, right? And for a couple of words back and forth. But the spiritual aspect, because in a way, from a scientific perspective, I mean, we don't really know, or we can't observe when the communication is happening. So what they're talking about really is some kind of internal
Right.
transformation that's maybe a constant inner dialogue, right? It doesn't depend on a phone call. They're constantly talking maybe to their ancestors, right? And it's not like they're creating their own purpose, their own goal. It's actually an advantage that it's less practical because they're in full control of it. And And it's always there, right? It's not just happenstance. So I think that's, I think now that I'm thinking about it more seriously for the first time, something about that is why it makes it more successful, because their spirituality is something they carry with them constantly, whereas practical matters, the whole problem is these contexts for using the language don't really exist in New York City. They are, to a large extent, languages of the telephone in some case.
Yeah.
Now, the other one about AI is a different problem. And, what I said to the, the Korean instructor, I think, who asked it, is that it's obviously an amazing tool, obviously taking the world by force, and it's able to master languages in a frighteningly good way. But ironically, it's doing something quite dangerous or negative for the purposes of indigenous language revitalization, which is that it's flattening out all of the individual flavor, all the individual aspect of the language. So you, again, going back to why are people learning it, why does indigenous revitalization, language revitalization happen? It's not to get ahead in a life or in order to it's not to like get ahead in the company or it's not in order to be able necessarily even to talk to a relative. It's really kind of recreating yourself and
Right.
kind of undoing certain processes of colonization and forced assimilation. It's kind of becoming the person that you think you were supposed to be. And a lot of that is it's individualistic and it's family-based and it's about, specific people who are either, your grandparents or someone who's had an influence on you. And the whole thing about AI is it's a data soup, right? And even the people who create AI don't know exactly what's going on
Right.
how it's doing they know how it does what it does on a bigger level, but not why it's choosing this word or this pronunciation. And it's the absolute average of the data that it has, and that's not helpful necessarily
Yeah.
for some, right? Somebody wants to know the words their grandmother said, the way she spoke,
Right.
the quirks that she had, and AI is like the destroyer of quirks and individuality.
Woof. Okay. There's a soundbite. If not for the top of the episode, I'll keep that for myself.
Well, it's interesting. This reminds me, my parents continuously receive requests to quote unquote translate this old German handwriting, Sütterlin, that no one, I didn't learn how to write that in school. My parents' generation did. I can kind of make out a couple of words, but they just recently, people who are into genealogy, all these documents were written in this style, and AI can't handle that at all. Partially because oftentimes the documents are of such poor quality that no screen reader could even make anything of it. But I think
Right.
even if it is a legible document, AI is like, got nothing.
Yeah. But if only it said I got nothing.
Well,
That's the other problem.
that's
Yeah,
true. That
right,
is
right.
true.
That's
Oh, no,
the
it
other
has
problem.
opinions.
It always has opinions, doesn't it? Probably
that is
reflecting its
very true.
creators. No, that's a real danger, actually. I should mention that as well, because once, during the peak of the chat GPT-3 craze, I wanted to see, like, what could it do in terms of translation, right? And I tested it on languages that I know and that I know have a lot of data out there on the internet, and it did a laudable job for sure. Just as good, if not better, than Google Translate. But then I wanted to see what it would do on a language that I knew it didn't have much access to, like namely Garifuna, which is one of these kind of hidden communities, you could say, with really thousands of speakers in New York City. Very little written literature and very little presence on the internet. So I asked it, translate these sentences into Garifuna. And amazingly, it produced something. I should ask, what do you think? What do you think it produced?
Oh, certainly not an accurate translation.
No.
I don't know.
Yeah, enlighten us.
Yeah.
So this is kind of like the way that, well, I don't know. I guess humans could deceive us in the same way, but this is kind of the natural built-in deceptiveness of AI, is that it produced something that shockingly looked a lot like Garifuna, but was total gibberish.
Oh, interesting.
I'm like, how did it do that? It had just enough Garifuna so that it could figure out what the characters are. So it
Okay.
identified, all of the characters. And I guess it identified like the binomial pairs. So it had like a syllable structure that looked like Garifuna. And to somebody who didn't know, they would totally think that this is it.
Yeah.
Wow.
And then I was like, I was shocked because like, how does it know to produce something that actually looks like it?
Yeah.
And yet it's total gibberish. I said, what is this? And then, of course, the hilarious thing with ChatGPT 3 is like, he's all, like, that's gibberish. And then it says, oh, I'm so
Yeah, exactly.
sorry. I don't know how I did that. That was, and then you ask to translate something else. That's the same thing. And it's like, you lied to me again. Oh my God, but then it was even obnoxious enough when I asked it, like, can you give me a word-by-word translation? It said, oh yes, bugu means dog, and this means cat, and this means... So it would go all out in lying to you. Like, it was just such a professional deceiver.
Wow.
So that's another dangerous thing. That's totally different from the whole, flattening of
Right.
individuality, which is that it doesn't tell you I don't know this.
Exactly.
It just makes it up.
Oh,
Yep.
boy.
Man, that's crazy.
Well, thank you for sharing that with us. I appreciate it.
No, absolutely. Well, Dan, we could keep talking with you. This is all so fascinating, and thank you for doing all this important work. But before we sign off, we'd like to ask you for a word in a language that you love or learning, may want to learn, that makes you feel inspired.
Inspired. Okay. Well, I like the word, there's an English word, which I don't know if it's easy to translate into other languages. I never thought about it, but I like, like to redouble your efforts. When I think of inspired, I'm always like behind. So inspired for me means like trying to catch up with people. So like to redouble, it's like you've kind of maxed out already. You've done all you can and you've doubled already. And now you have to redouble. So redouble your efforts. And then in Tagalog, there's a nice word, bawi, which can mean, it doesn't have a easy translation in English, but it basically means to bumawi, to get back to where you... how can I translate bumawi? Bawi. In any case, it has several related meanings. One of them is like to catch up, like in a game, And when there's a team losing, then like a basketball game even, everybody will chant, bawi, 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 just to, work extra hard to catch up. So bawi is my favorite word, but it's really only inspiring when you're behind in the game like I usually am.
Well, we appreciate you sharing all of that with us. Thank you so much for speaking of language with us, Dan.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. Thanks so much.
Join us next week for our annual Thanksgiving special. We'll hear about gratitude from the LRC team and some other familiar voices.
Until then.
Auf Wiederhören.
The Language Resource Center is located on the ground floor of Stimson Hall on Cornell's main campus in Ithaca, New York. Check us out on the web at lrc.cornell.edu.
And follow Cornell LRC on Facebook, Instagram, and Blue Sky.
Speaking of Language is produced by Angelika Kramer and Sam Lupowitz.
Recorded by Sam Lupowitz.
Original music by Sam Lupowitz, Dan Gable, and Joe Gibson.
Thanks also to the College of Arts and Sciences at Cornell University.
As a reminder, the ideas and opinions expressed on this podcast do not reflect those of the College of Arts and Sciences or any other official entity of Cornell University.
We thank our listeners, and do stay tuned for our next episode.